Well, this morning we are going to continue in our study of the book of Esther, and we're coming to chapter 7 of Esther. Here is the word of the Lord. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet, and as they were drinking wine on that second day, the king asked again, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favour with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. That is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing?" Esther answered, "An adversary, an enemy, this vile Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, Will you even molest the queen while she sits with me in the house?" As soon as the words left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole reaching to the height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." The king said, "Impale him on it." So they impaled Haman on the pole which he'd set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. Amen. This morning, we turn our attention to chapter 7 of the book of Esther. And we read about the first objective in Esther and Mordecai's plan being complete. You'll remember that they have two objectives in their plan to deal with Haman's evil plan. Firstly, oust Haman. And then secondly, try and repeal the king's edict. This morning, we read that objective 1 is complete in a scene full of intrigue and hijinks. Chapter 7 is a story about the details of how Queen Esther outwits her adversary, Haman, in statecraft and court politics. But it's a story that highlights two important points concerning a bigger and more universal narrative. The story begins by telling us that Xerxes and Haman arrived at the banquet being prepared by Queen Esther. This is the 7th banquet mentioned in the book. You remember that the Persians loved a party. They also, as they were enjoying themselves, the king asked Esther again what her request would be. What happens next is very interesting, because Esther wants to tell the king about Haman's plan, but she has to do it in such a way as to not incriminate the king. So Esther skirts round this minefield by initially saying to the king that her life is in danger, and then tying her life and the life of her people together. "Your Majesty, if it pleases you, grant my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request." By leading with the fact that her life was in danger, it aroused Xerxes' sense of wanting to defend his wife. And the author tells us that the king became enraged at the thought of someone threatening the life of his queen. And it's at that point that Esther releases both barrows into Haman by pointing to Haman and saying it's he who's a mastermind behind the threat. At this, Xerxes needs to leave the table. He is furious, so he storms out into the garden to try and think about what just happened. Now, Haman is no idiot, and he knows his life is on a sugary peg, but he is so fearful and panicked that he forgets the court protocol at that time, that a woman of the harem should never be left alone with a man. When Xerxes left the room, Haman should have followed him, or at least withdrawn from the dining room area, so that Queen Esther would be left on her own. However, that evening, he probably didn't fancy following the king, who was fuming at him. And to withdraw would probably mean admitting guilt and kind of running away from the situation. So the only option open to him was to throw himself at Esther, to plead with her, so that she may show him mercy. Then the king enters the room again and sees Haman touching Queen Esther, which enrages him even further than before. And he jumps to the conclusion that he was trying to molest her. Now, I think most readers would agree that it's probably unlikely to have happened that way. It's probably that Haman was so desperate that he fell on the couch by mistake, and it was out of pure need and necessity than anything sexual. That being said, it probably allowed Xerxes the opportunity and the pretense to get rid of Haman. So it was a handy ploy for the king to remove his former trusted second in command. This episode ends with huge irony, as Haman is impaled on the pole that he had set up for Mordecai. Objective 1 of Esther and Mordecai's plan is complete. They have got rid of Haman with skill and cunning. And the remaining chapters of the story, which we'll tackle over the next few weeks, we will see how they tackle objective 2. Now, although this chapter of Esther has all the writings of a kind of political or medieval courtroom drama, with all its politics and cloak and dagger dealings, there's also several truths which can be taken from chapter 7 of Esther. And I've used the title, A Word of Warning and a Word of Encouragement. And we now move on to thinking about the heading, A Word of Warning. And the warning is about the blindness which comes from carrying out sinful actions. Repeatedly throughout the book of Esther, we have seen Haman go blindly about his evil plan, thinking that he is the bee's knees. How often have we read about him boasting about his position of power, his closeness to the king and queen? Until chapter 7, it was almost in every chapter you would read Haman would gather his wife and friends around and boast to them. However, at virtually every step and decision made, it's bitten Haman in the bum. And there's 3 clear examples of this. The first one I've labelled, he couldn't see past his own nose, and it talks about what we studied last week. Last week, you remember that the king wanted to honour Mordecai, and he asked Haman, how would the king honour someone that he's pleased with? And Haman just thought that he was talking about him. So he thought up this massive big procession, unbeknown that it was actually for Mordecai. And so there was Haman having to cart Mordecai around the streets of Susa. He couldn't see past his own nose. The second one I've titled is, he constructed huge gallows for Mordecai. We read about that in the last chapter as well. But it was he who was impaled on them rather than Mordecai. And thirdly, he boasted about being invited to a private dinner with the king and queen. He was loving that he had such a close relationship with them. But he was actually going to his Last Supper, and he was being invited to his own execution. In each of these three examples, Haman was blind to the truth of the situation. And that's the trouble with evil and sin. Sin immediately blocks us from God, and God is the only source of truth. When we're blocked from God, we lose sight of the truth, and our own kind of sinful natures almost make stuff up. In all of these three examples, Haman thought he was doing well, and it turned out to be the opposite of what he thought. And it's not just Haman who's blind to the truth because of sin. You may remember the story of David and Bathsheba. David used his position of power to abuse Bathsheba, and she eventually got pregnant. So David came up with a huge deliberate plan to try and get Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, to sleep with Bathsheba so that he could pass it off as Uriah's rather than David's. And he tried all sorts of ways, but Uriah was an honourable man, and he was a commander of the army. So when his troops were sleeping rough on the fields, he slept outside of his house because his men were not going to have the same pleasures that he was. So eventually David just had to kill him, and he sent him to where the thickest fighting happens, and kind of withdrew so that he was sadly killed by the army. But later, the prophet Nathan challenged David about his actions. But he didn't go right out and challenge him. He told him this story about this powerful man trying to get something that this less powerful man happened. And it was his pride and joy. But this most powerful man took it from the least powerful man. And David, when he heard this, was furious. He wanted to address this injustice. The book of Samuel tells us that David burned with anger when Nathan told him this. And then Nathan said to David, "You are the man." David was blind to the wrong that he committed. And it's the same with Haman. He was blind to the reality of his situation because he was so consumed by the sin, he couldn't see the truth, even though it was almost right in front of him. The amazing thing about chapter 7 of Esther is that it's not ultimately about the character of Esther, Xerxes, Mordecai, or even Haman. The book of Esther is about God and what he has done and continues to do for his people. Chapter 7, although gloomy in the fact that Haman ends up impaled on a pole, there's also encouragement contained within the story. Although the immediate actions of Esther led to the downfall of Haman, it was ultimately God who made it happen. And the key pivot for the downfall of Haman is centered on that sleepless night. And that is why I've titled this section of the sermon, Sleepless in Susa. This was the one night when God made Xerxes have so much trouble sleeping, he asked for the book of Chronicles to be brought in the hope that they would send him to sleep. That one action had significant ramifications for the whole story of Esther, for Mordecai, and for the Jewish people. You may remember when we started this book, I said that the book of Esther was set when the Jewish people, or some of them, had returned to their homeland. And the book of Esther was specifically a book about those Jews who remained in foreign lands. And one of the key questions of the time is, would God still be with us, even though we're not in Israel? Chapter 7 of Esther confirms that he is still with them. He's still looking out for them and protecting them from harm. And this is the amazing thing about God. He has promised that he will be with his people. Now, that doesn't mean that life is going to be all butterflies and roses and all comfortable. God doesn't promise any of us that. But he has promised that he will be with us. He'll bring comfort no matter what we're facing in life. We're going to have a brief pause at this point, and we're going to have a hymn which confirms that God is with us no matter what we're facing in life. And the first verse of the hymn goes like this: "When I fear my faith will fail, Christ will hold me fast. When the tempter would prevail, he will hold me fast. I could never keep my hold through life's fearful path, for my love is often cold. He must hold me fast." And this hymn should give us comfort that no matter what we face in life, we have a God that cares and will help us as we journey through. So let us stand. In this section, we are going to look at how we apply this passage to our lives and what truths we can take away from it today and think about during the week. The first point we made this morning was that sin and evil makes us blind to the truth. Using the example of Haman and King David, we could see within the Bible that these two men were blind to the truth, staring them in the face. I wonder whether we have the same thing happen to us. Has there been a time in our lives where we've been doing something, but we aren't just aware how bad it is until our conscience tells us, or someone points out the truth to us? I know from my own life that there has been cases where I have done that. So as I've been so kind of absorbed by whatever that thing is, it's not until someone comes along and says, "Wait a minute, James, this isn't what's actually happening. You're blind to the truth." And that's the trouble with sin. Sometimes it can consume us so much that we don't actually know what is in front of our face. And the reason that we're blind is that sin usually isolates us from God and from those who care about us, those who typically would tell us the truth. I don't know about you, but when I mess up, I tend to try to run away from God. I feel that I'm not worthy, so I try to isolate myself from him rather than run toward him. Because I know if I come close to him, it just kind of highlights what I've done wrong and makes me feel like a hypocrite. Additionally, many of our sins also isolate us from the people that love us most dearly. And the reason behind this is the same: shame. We feel ashamed of what we have done. And the trouble with sin is that it tends to make us isolated beings and feel like we're cut off from God and from others. And probably the prime example we can see this from the Bible is the Garden of Eden. When Adam and Eve committed sin and ate from the apple that they weren't meant to have eaten from, they tried to hide from God, and they covered themselves in fig leaves initially because they felt shame for the first time. It isolated them, or it appeared to isolate them from God and from each other. However, in the Garden of Eden, we will remember that God went looking for them and cried out, "Where are you?" Those three words should give us encouragement, because we have a God who's not sitting on his hands waiting for us to come to him, but we have a God who's looking for us. In the book of Esther, we have repeatedly seen how God is working away, using the character of Esther and Mordecai, using the character of even Xerxes to save his people. This should give us encouragement that we have a faithful God and know that no matter how many times we mess up, he is still there seeking us out. Earlier, we talked about our feelings of shame, guilt, and hypocrisy when we sin, and how that typically leads us to run from God rather than to him. When we feel these feelings, we have to remember that God is faithful and committed to his people. And that led God himself to bear all those feelings of shame, guilt, and hypocrisy, all of other sins on the cross. So we don't have to bear them ourselves, but we give them to Jesus and let him take care of them. And that should free us from those feelings and allow us to run to God and find contentment in him. This morning there may be some here who are feeling feelings of hypocrisy, guilt, and shame. And to deal with them, we may try and isolate ourselves from God. But I would encourage us to do the opposite, to place those burdens on the person of Jesus Christ so that we can be free of them. Chapter 7 of Esther is action-packed for only 10 verses. But it's an episode of tense drama as the story's villain gets his just deserts. It's a chapter that has a word of warning about the seriousness and the blindness of sin and how it isolates us from God and our loved ones. However, we have a God who doesn't leave us to our own devices. But because he is faithful to his people, he is working behind the scenes to save them. And through his action, objective 1 in our story has been reached. And for us here gathered today, this passage should be an encouragement as we remember that God is faithful. It should encourage us, if we have these feelings of guilt, shame, and hypocrisy, to place them on the person of Jesus. To put these feelings at the feet of Jesus and cling to him. Amen.